Perfect wasn't supposed to have a price tag. That's what Marcus Johnson kept telling himself as he stared at the envelope from Riverside University. 4 years of straight A's. Countless nights studying by candlelight when the electricity got cut off. Working part-time while maintaining perfect attendance. Leading the debate team. Tutoring kids at church. A lifetime of doing everything right. But now, sitting at his kitchen table while his mother's cornbread filled the air with its sweet, familiar smell, Marcus knew that sometimes perfect wasn't enough. Sometimes dreams came with price tags too heavy to carry. Sometimes the world had other plans, no matter how hard you worked or how many boxes you checked. He didn't know that someone had been watching him all along. Someone who recognized in Marcus the same fire, the same determination, the same spirit of lifting others that had sparked a quiet revolution decades ago. Someone who understood that some dreams were too important to let slip away. But that would come later. Right now, Marcus Johnson's fingers traced the edges of the cream-colored envelope from Riverside University. The paper felt expensive, smooth and thick under his fingertips. His future sat inside this envelope, waiting to either bloom or wither away. Marcus Johnson's fingers traced the edges of the cream-colored envelope from Riverside University. The paper felt expensive, smooth and thick under his fingertips. His future sat inside this envelope, waiting to either bloom or wither away. The kitchen of their small apartment filled with the warm, sweet smell of his mother's cornbread. The familiar scent usually brought comfort, but today it couldn't calm the thunder of his heartbeat. "Baby, that envelope won't open itself," his mother, Diana, said softly. She wiped her hands on her nurse's aide uniform and leaned against the counter. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from working double shifts, but her smile remained bright and hopeful. Marcus nodded, but couldn't make himself break the seal. His mind drifted to all the late nights that had led to this moment. 3 years earlier, their electricity had been cut off during final exams week. Marcus had sat at this same kitchen table, textbooks spread around him like fallen leaves, studying by candlelight. The flames had cast dancing shadows across his algebra problems, while his mother worked an extra shift to get the lights turned back on. "You keep studying, baby," she'd said before leaving that night. "Your brain is going to light up this whole apartment brighter than any bulb." He'd earned an A+ on that exam. 2 years ago, when the grocery store hired him as a stock boy, he'd created a schedule that seemed impossible. School from 8 to 3, debate team until 5, work until 9, then homework until his eyes burned. But he'd done it. Every single day. "You're burning the candle at both ends," his mother had worried. "Good thing we've had practice with candles," he'd joked, making her laugh despite her concern. Last year, when his elderly neighbor Mrs. Washington had asked if he could help her grandson with math, Marcus had added tutoring to his packed schedule. Soon, he was helping half a dozen kids from church with their studies. He'd set up a study group in the community room of their apartment building, teaching younger students the tricks that helped him maintain his perfect grades. "You're going to be an amazing teacher someday," Mrs. Washington had said, her aged hands patting his cheek. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, Marcus felt the weight of all those moments. His perfect 4.0 GPA hadn't come easy. He'd earned every single A through grit and determination, through nights when exhaustion made his vision blur, and mornings when he had to force himself awake before dawn. The envelope seemed to grow heavier in his hands. "Marcus." His mother's voice drew him back to the present. She'd stepped away from the oven and now stood beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder. "Whatever that letter says, I want you to remember something." He looked up at her, drawing strength from the fierce pride in her eyes. "You've already won," she said firmly. "Every test you aced, every kid you helped, every hour you worked while keeping up those grades, those are victories that nobody can take away from you." The oven timer chimed, but Diana didn't move to check the cornbread. Some moments were more important than perfect timing. Marcus took a deep breath and slid his thumb under the envelope's flap. The tears seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, unfolded it with trembling hands, and began to read. "Dear Mr. Johnson," he read aloud, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We are pleased to inform you that your academic achievements have earned you acceptance to Riverside University's class of 2029. His mother's grip Marcus continued, his voice dropping slightly. "We regret to inform you that the Presidential Merit Scholarship has been awarded to another candidate." The words that followed blurred on the page. Something about a strong applicant. Pool. Something about limited spots. Something about encouraging him to explore other financial aid options. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the kitchen table. Diana squeezed his shoulder again, but Marcus couldn't look up. At her. He knew what this meant. Without the scholarship, Riverside might as well be on the moon. His mother's salary barely covered their apartment and basic needs. Even with his part-time job, even with other financial aid, the gap would be too wide to bridge. The oven timer chimed again, more insistent this time. "The cornbread," Marcus said mechanically, starting to rise. "Let it burn," his mother replied, her voice thick with emotions she was trying to control. "Some things are more important than cornbread." But Marcus stood anyway, gently removing his mother's hand from his shoulder. He crossed to the oven, put on the mitts, and carefully removed the golden brown cornbread. The familiar motions helped him think, helped him process. "We'll figure something out," Diana said, but her voice carried the weight of too many bills, too many late notices, too many nights working double shifts. Marcus placed the cornbread on the cooling rack. The sweet, warm smell that had filled the kitchen all evening now seemed to mock him. He turned to face his mother, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "At least they accepted me," he said, trying to sound positive. "That's something, right?" Diana crossed the kitchen and pulled him into a fierce hug. At 17, Marcus stood nearly a foot taller than his mother. But in that moment, he felt like a small child again, safe in her embrace. "It's more than something," she whispered. "It's everything. And this isn't over, Marcus Johnson. This is just the beginning." Over his mother's shoulder, Marcus could see the letter on the table. The expensive cream-colored paper caught the kitchen, light, gleaming like fool's gold. He closed his eyes, letting his mother's words wash over him, trying to believe them. But in his heart, a question echoed. How could this be just the beginning when it felt so much like the end? The evening sun slanted through their kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor. In the apartment next door, someone was playing music, the bass thrumming through the thin walls. Life was going on, ordinary and unchanged, while Marcus felt his dreams slipping through his fingers like water. His mother finally released him from the hug, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Sit down," she said, her nurse's aid efficiency returning to her voice. "That cornbread isn't going to eat itself." Marcus nodded, watching as she bustled around the kitchen, cutting the cornbread, getting out plates and butter. The familiar routine felt like a lifeline in that moment, something solid to hold on to while his mind spun with questions and calculations. Maybe he could pick up more hours at the grocery store. Maybe he could find a second job. Maybe he could... The sound of a plate being set in front of him interrupted his thoughts. His mother sat down across from him, her own plate untouched. "We're going to pray," she said firmly, holding out her hands. Marcus took her hands across the table, bowing his head as his mother's voice filled their small kitchen with words of gratitude and hope. But even as she prayed for guidance and blessings, even as she thanked God for Marcus's acceptance to Riverside, a new thought began to take shape in his mind. Maybe it was time to let go of some dreams and focus on others. Maybe instead of college, he should look for full-time work, help his mother with the bills, save some money. Maybe. The prayer ended, but neither of them reached for their cornbread. The acceptance letter sat between them on the table, its words final and unchanging, while outside their window, the sun continued its slow descent toward night. The next morning, Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from a night of restless sleep, but his school uniform was crisp and perfect, just like his grades, just like his attendance record, just like everything else that apparently wasn't enough. "Marcus," his mother called from the kitchen. "Mrs. Torres left a message. She wants to see you first thing this morning." Of course she did. His guidance counselor had been almost as invested in the scholarship as he was. Almost. The walk to school felt longer than usual. Marcus passed the elementary school where he tutored kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the convenience store where he helped Mr. Chen stock shelves on weekends, and the church where he volunteered held a piece of the perfect application he'd built. Piece by careful piece. Riverside's rejection of his scholarship application hadn't just rejected him. It had rejected his whole community, all the people who'd helped him, believed in him, pushed him forward. The high school halls were quiet when he arrived. Most students wouldn't show up for another 20 minutes, but the guidance office light was already on. Through the frosted glass, he could see Mrs. Torres's silhouette at her desk. He knocked softly. "Come in, Marcus." Mrs. Torres's voice wavered slightly. When he opened the door, he found her surrounded by papers, his transcripts, his letters of recommendation, his application essays. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "I've been here since 6, going through everything again. Looking for something I might have missed. Something we could have done differently." Marcus sank into the chair. "It's okay, Mrs. Torres. You did everything you could." "Did I?" She shuffled through the papers. Perfect grades, perfect attendance, leadership positions, community service, glowing recommendations from every teacher. Your application was... She paused, swallowing hard. Perfect. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. The committee, Mrs. Torres continued carefully, chose another candidate they felt was better suited for their program. Better suited, Marcus repeated quietly. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Mrs. Torres's hands clenched around his transcript. "I requested information about the selected candidate. About all the candidates, actually. I've been comparing qualifications, looking at patterns in their selections over the past 5 years." Something in her voice made Marcus look up sharply. "What did you find?" She met his eyes, then quickly looked away. "I'm still gathering data. But Marcus..." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "This isn't over. I'm not letting this go." "Mrs. Torres," Marcus said gently, "maybe it's time to let it go. Maybe I should focus on other options. Community college, maybe. Or trade school." "No." The force of her response startled them both. "No, Marcus. I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've helped hundreds of students find their path. But you..." She stood up. walking to the wall of college pennants behind her desk. You're special, not just because of your grades or your achievements. It's who you are. She turned back to face him. Last week, I saw you helping Tommy Chen with his college essays. You stayed 2 hours after school, working with him, encouraging him. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't part of your tutoring job. You did it because that's who you are. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Tommy's a good kid. He just needed some help finding the right words. Exactly. Mrs. Torres returned to her desk. And that's why you belong at Riverside. That's why you deserve that scholarship. Because you don't just achieve greatness, you lift others up with you. The first bell rang, making them both jump. Go to class, Mrs. Torres said, wiping quickly at her eyes. But come back at lunch. We're going to talk about appeals processes and alternative scholarships. This isn't over. Marcus stood, shouldering his backpack. At the door, he paused. Mrs. Torres, thank you for everything. She nodded, already reaching for her phone. Go on. You can't break that perfect attendance record now. The halls were filling with students as Marcus made his way to first period AP Physics. Everything looked normal. Same lockers, same faces, same morning chatter. But something had shifted. He felt it in his chest, a heaviness that made each step harder than the last. In physics, he took his usual seat in the front row. Mr. Patterson was writing equations on the board, the same ones that were already neatly copied in Marcus's notebook. He'd studied ahead, of course. Perfect preparation, perfect understanding, perfect. Marcus? Mr. Patterson's voice broke through his thoughts. The answer to number 3? Marcus straightened in his chair, the solution already on his lips. This was what he did. This was who he was. Perfect answers, perfect student, perfectly not enough. The morning crawled by. In each class, Marcus took his usual detailed notes, raised his hand for every question, helped other students when they struggled. But now each action felt hollow, like he was acting in a play where the ending had already been written. At lunch, instead of joining his friends in the cafeteria, he returned to Mrs. Torres's office. She had even more papers spread across her desk now, and her computer screen was filled with spreadsheets. Sit down, she said without looking up. I've been making some calls. For the next 40 minutes, she laid out a battle plan. Appeals to the scholarship committee, letters to alumni associations. Her energy was almost frightening in its intensity. And look at this, she said, turning her computer screen toward him. I've been analyzing the scholarship recipients for the past 5 years. Notice anything? Marcus studied the spreadsheet, his heart sinking as patterns emerged. But before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Principal Rogers stepped into the office, his face grave. Amanda, he said to Mrs. Torres, can I speak with you for a moment? I'm with a student, she replied, her voice tight. Now, please. Mrs. Torres stood, squeezing Marcus's shoulder as she passed. Through the door's frosted glass, he could see their silhouettes engaged in an intense discussion. Mrs. Torres's hands moved animatedly, while Principal Rogers shook his head repeatedly. When she returned, her face was flushed with anger. Marcus, she said carefully, I've been advised to focus on helping you explore other options. The administration feels that pursuing this matter could damage the school's relationship with Riverside University. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. I understand. No, you don't, she said fiercely. Because I'm not stopping. I'm just going to have to be more careful about how I proceed. Mrs. Torres. Marcus started to protest, but she cut him off. Go back to class. But know this, 23 years ago, I made a promise to myself that I would fight for every student who came through that door. Every single one. I'm not breaking that promise now. As Marcus walked to his next class, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Got called into work early. Left dinner in the fridge. Love you. Stay strong. He typed back a quick reply, then paused in the hallway. To his right was his AP Literature classroom, where perfect essays and thoughtful discussions awaited. To his left was the exit, leading to a world where perfect wasn't enough, where dreams came with price tags, where the late bell rang. Marcus turned right, walking into his literature class just as the teacher began taking attendance. Perfect attendance, perfect grades, perfect transcript. But as he sat down at his desk, his mother's words from the night before echoed in his mind. This isn't over, Marcus Johnson. This is just the beginning. The question was, the beginning of what? At his desk, Marcus opened his notebook to a fresh page. At the top, in his neat handwriting, he wrote the date. Below it, he began to take notes, each letter perfectly formed, each point carefully organized. But in the margins, almost without realizing it, he started a different list. A list of questions that had no perfect answers. Why wasn't perfect enough? What made the other candidate better suited? How many others had faced this same wall? And most importantly, what was he going to do about it? The last question sat there, challenging him, as his teacher discussed the theme of justice in their current novel. Marcus underlined it once, then again, the pen pressing harder with each stroke. Outside the classroom window, the autumn sun hung high in the sky, its light falling across his perfect notes, his perfect questions, and the imperfect world that waited beyond. The apartment was dark when Marcus got home that evening, no smell of cooking from the kitchen, no sound of his mother humming as she sorted laundry, just silence and shadows, broken only by the blinking red light of their answering machine. He pressed play while dropping his backpack by the door. Baby, they needed extra help at the hospital tonight. His mother's tired voice filled the empty room. Mrs. Peterson in room 312 isn't doing well, and they're short-staffed again. I left some money on the counter for pizza. Don't wait up. Second extra shift this week. Third this month. Marcus's throat tightened as he deleted the message. In his room, he stared at the wall of college pennants and motivational posters he'd collected over the years. Riverside's deep blue and gold banner hung in the center, surrounded by quotes about perseverance and success. Words that had once inspired him now seemed to mock his efforts. With sudden determination, he reached for the Riverside pennant. The thumbtack came out easily, leaving a tiny hole in the wall. He was about to crumple the pennant when his phone buzzed, a text from Tommy Chen. Thanks again for helping with my essays. Just got accepted to state. Marcus's hand froze on the pennant. Tommy had worked so hard on those essays, staying late after school, drafting and redrafting until each word was perfect. His family had come to America when he was 10, and English still sometimes tripped him up. But he'd done it. He'd achieved his dream. Slowly, Marcus put the pennant down on his desk instead of in the trash. He texted back, "Congratulations, you earned it." 3 dots appeared as Tommy typed a response. "Couldn't have done it without you. You're going to be an amazing career he'd planned to pursue at Riverside. Their education program was one of the best in the state. But now, Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up a job search site. Maybe the grocery store had full-time positions available, or the warehouse where his cousin worked. They were always hiring, and the pay was decent. He could work for a year or two, save up some money, maybe try community college part-time. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mrs. Torres. "Don't. Give up. Still working on options. Meet tomorrow before school?" He started to type yes, then deleted it. Started to type no, then deleted that too. Finally, he put the phone down without responding. The silence of the apartment pressed in around him. Usually by this time, his mother would be home, asking about his day, sharing stories from the hospital, filling their small space with warmth and life. But lately, she was home less and less. Extra shifts, overtime, weekend work. Anything to try to close the gap between their reality and his dreams. Marcus walked to the kitchen and found the pizza money on the counter, next to a stack of mail, bills mostly. He recognized the shapes and colors of the envelopes: electric, yellow; rent, white; medical, blue. His mother always arranged them in order of importance, a careful dance of which payment could wait and which couldn't. But beneath the usual bills lay an envelope he didn't recognize, heavy cream paper, like the Riverside letter had been, but addressed to Diana Johnson in elegant handwriting. No return address. Marcus picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The seal was unbroken. His mother must have been too tired to open it this morning before rushing to work. The weight of the envelope felt significant somehow. Important, but it wasn't his to open, so he placed it back on the counter. Instead of ordering pizza, he opened the fridge. They had eggs, some slightly wilted vegetables, half a loaf of bread. He could make dinner, save the pizza money for something more important. Another small contribution to the impossible dream. As he cooked, his mind wandered back to the mysterious envelope. Who would send his mother such an official-looking letter? Maybe another hospital offering her a better-paying position. She'd been talking about getting her LPN certification, taking night classes while working days, but they both knew that was impossible now. They could barely afford their current bills, let alone tuition for both of them. The eggs sizzled in the pan, and Marcus added the chopped vegetables. His mother had taught him to cook when he was 12, insisting that education meant more than just books. Life skills, she'd called it, showing him how to budget groceries, do laundry, change a tire, preparing him to be independent, successful, ready for college. The food nearly burned as that thought hit him. All those life skills, all that preparation, all her sacrifices, and for what? So he could watch her work herself to exhaustion. Trying to make up for a scholarship that should have been his, he plated the food but couldn't bring himself to eat. Instead, he wrapped his portion and put it in the fridge for his mother. She'd need it more after her double shift. Back in his room, Marcus looked at his wall again, next to the riverside. Pennant sat his debate team trophies, honor roll certificates, perfect attendance awards, testaments to his dedication, his mother's sacrifices, their shared dream. One by one, he began taking them down. The debate trophies went into a box. He wouldn't need them anymore. The certificates followed. Perfect grades wouldn't pay the bills. The attendance awards, the leadership pins, the volunteer recognition plaques, each one carefully packed away, making room for a different kind of future. Only the Riverside pennant remained, lying flat on his desk where he'd placed it earlier. He reached for it again, but Tommy's text message flashed in his mind. "You're going to be an amazing teacher someday. Someday. Just not now. Maybe not ever." The sound of a key in the lock startled him. It was barely 9. His mother shouldn't be home for hours. "Marcus?" Her voice sounded strange, strained. He found her in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, staring at the mysterious envelope on the counter. "Mama? What's wrong? Why are you home early?" She picked up the envelope with trembling hands. "Mrs. Peterson passed away," she said softly. "They sent everyone home while the family—" She trailed off, still staring at the envelope. "This wasn't here this morning." "It came today," Marcus said. "I didn't open it." Diana ran her finger along the seal, but didn't break it. "After Mrs. Peterson, I kept thinking about time, about chances, about dreams deferred." She looked up at her son, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm so tired of dreams being deferred." The envelope seemed to grow heavier in her hands as the kitchen clock. A siren wailed in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond their small apartment, a world that kept turning despite their paused dreams. "Mama," Marcus started, but she shook her head. "Not tonight," she whispered, placing the envelope back on the counter. "I can't. Not tonight." She noticed the wrapped plate in the fridge, the unused pizza money on the counter, the dishes drying in the rack, small signs of her son's care, his constant thoughtfulness, his perfect responsibility. "You should be worrying about prom dates and graduation speeches," she said, her voice cracking. "Not cooking dinner and saving money and—" She gestured at the bills on the counter. "It's okay, Mama," Marcus said, moving to hug her. "We'll figure something out." But as he held his mother, feeling how thin she'd become, how tired she was, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd tell Mrs. Torres to stop looking for options. Tomorrow, he'd apply for that warehouse job. Tomorrow, he'd start being practical instead of perfect. The mysterious envelope sat on the counter, unopened, watching them like an eye from another world, holding whatever secrets or disappointments waited inside its expensive paper shell. Some dreams, Marcus realized, cost too much to keep. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Marcus sat in his usual spot in the third pew of New Hope Baptist Church, his mother beside him in her best dress, the one she saved for church and special occasions. Neither of them had mentioned college or scholarships for the past 3 days. The mysterious envelope remained unopened on their kitchen counter, like a visitor no one knew how to greet. Pastor Reynolds stood at the pulpit, his deep voice filling the sanctuary. "Today," he said, "I want to talk about perseverance." His eyes found Marcus in the congregation. About faith in the face of injustice, about community in times of trial. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't told anyone at church about the scholarship rejection, but news traveled fast in their tight-knit community. His mother squeezed his hand as Pastor Reynolds continued. "When one of us faces a locked door," the pastor said, "we all feel the key turn. When one of us is denied a seat at the table, we all stay hungry." The congregation murmured their agreement. Mrs. Washington, who sat in the pew behind Marcus, patted his shoulder gently. "But let me tell you something about locked doors." Pastor Reynolds's voice rose with passion. "They can't keep out the light of truth. They can't stop the power of community. They can't silence the voice of justice." After the service, people gathered in the church basement for coffee and fellowship. Marcus tried to slip out quietly, but it seemed like everyone wanted to speak with him. "My cousin's on the alumni board at Riverside," Mrs. Jackson told him. "I made some calls. The youth group is organizing a letter-writing campaign," Mr. Taylor added. "Those scholarship people need to explain themselves." Marcus nodded politely, thanked them for their support, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd already made his decision. Tomorrow, he would withdraw his acceptance to Riverside. Tomorrow, He would. "Marcus," Pastor Reynolds called him over. "A moment, please." In the pastor's small office, surrounded by books and the scent of old leather, Marcus sat across from the man who had baptized him, who had helped guide him through his father's death, who had written one of his recommendation letters. "Mrs. Torres called me," Pastor Reynolds said quietly. "She told me about her investigation into the scholarship committee's history." Marcus stared at his hands. "It doesn't matter anymore. I'm going to withdraw my acceptance." "Look at me, son." Marcus raised his eyes reluctantly. "Do you know why I became a pastor?" Reynolds asked. "Because 30 years ago, I was you. Perfect, grades, big dreams, and a door that suddenly closed in my face." He stood, walking to a framed photograph on his wall. It showed a much younger version of himself standing with a group of other young men, all wearing graduation robes. "My community wouldn't let me give up," he continued. "They fought for me. They raised money. They wrote letters. They prayed." He turned back to Marcus. "And now it's our turn to fight for you. Pastor, I appreciate it, but this isn't just about you anymore, Marcus. This is about every child in our congregation who's watching you, every student who looks up to you, every dream that deserves a fair chance." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Mrs. Torres entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression Marcus had never seen before, part triumph, part anger. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I had to show you both this right away." She spread documents across the pastor's desk, spreadsheets, charts, highlighted, passages from old data, she explained, acceptance rates, demographics, interview notes. Someone in the records office owed me a favor. Marcus leaned forward despite himself. The numbers told a story that made his stomach twist. "It's not just you," Mrs. Torres said softly. "It's a pattern, a long one." Pastor Reynolds studied the documents, his expression darkening. "This needs to be addressed, not just for Marcus, but for—" A commotion from the church basement interrupted him. Raised voices, the sound of running feet. Then Diana appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "I need you to come home right now." "Mama? What's wrong?" She held up her phone. "I just got a call about the letter, the mysterious envelope." Marcus felt his heart skip. "What letter?" Mrs. Torres asked. But Diana was already pulling Marcus toward the door. "I'll explain later," she called over her shoulder. "Pastor, Mrs. Torres, thank you for everything. But right now..." The drive home was silent. Marcus watched his mother's hands grip the steering wheel too tightly, noticed the way she kept glancing at him as if making sure he was still there. Their apartment building looked the same as always. Faded brick, creaking elevator, familiar. Sounds of life behind closed doors. But something felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. In their kitchen, the cream-colored envelope waited exactly where they'd left it. Diana picked it up with shaking hands. "The call," she said finally. "It was from someone who knows what's in here. Someone who says this changes everything. Mama, who—" "I couldn't open it," she interrupted. "Not alone. Not without you." She held out the envelope to Marcus. Together, their fingers broke the seal that had tempted them for days. The paper was thick, expensive, like the riverside. Letter, but somehow more substantial, more significant. Diana unfolded the single sheet inside. Her eyes moved across the words, once, twice. A sound escaped her throat. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the kitchen floor like a fallen leaf. Marcus bent to pick it up, but his mother's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she whispered, "before you read it, before everything changes, I need you to know something." Outside their window, church bells rang for evening service. The sound carried across their neighborhood, past the elementary school where Marcus tutored, past the grocery store where he worked, past all the places that had shaped his dream and witnessed its unraveling. "No matter what that letter says," Diana continued, her voice growing stronger, "you've already made me prouder than any mother has ever been. Your perseverance, your kindness, your perfect heart. Those things matter more than any words, on dite, any paper." Marcus nodded, throat too tight for words. Then, slowly, he reached down and picked up the letter that waited to either save or shatter what remained of his dreams. The paper felt warm in his hands, as if it carried not just words but possibilities. With his mother's arm around his shoulders, Marcus began to read. Before Marcus could read more than the first line, a knock at their apartment door made both him and his mother jump. The letter crinkled in his startled grip. "Were you expecting someone?" he asked. Diana shook her head, moving toward the door. Through the peephole, she saw an elderly man in a well-worn but carefully pressed suit. He held a carved wooden cane and stood with the straight-backed posture of someone used to commanding attention. "Mrs. Johnson!" His voice carried clearly through the door. "My name is Benjamin Wright. I believe you received my letter." Diana's hand froze on the doorknob. Marcus stepped closer to his mother, the mysterious letter still in his hands. "I know this is unexpected," the man continued, his deep voice gentle but firm. "But I've been watching your son for quite some time now. Every Tuesday and Thursday at the grocery store. The way he helps Mrs. Martinez with her shopping bags. The patience he shows counting change for Mr. Thompson, who can barely see the numbers anymore." Marcus's eyes widened. He knew exactly who Benjamin Wright was. The quiet, elderly gentleman who always sat on the bench near the store entrance, reading his newspaper. The one who nodded hello but rarely spoke. The one who had been there, Marcus now realized, every single day he worked. Diana opened the door. Benjamin Wright stood in their hallway, his presence somehow filling the small space with dignity. He was tall, though age had begun to bend his shoulders, and his dark skin was mapped with the lines of nearly 8 decades of life. But his eyes were sharp and clear as they moved from Diana to Marcus, then to the letter in Marcus's hands. "Chantumaidri, I come in?" he asked. "We have much to discuss." Diana stepped back, allowing him to enter. In their small kitchen, Benjamin remained standing. His cane tapped softly against the linoleum floor as he gathered his thoughts. "First," he said, "I want to apologize for my roundabout approach. The letter, the watching from afar, it must seem strange. But I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" Marcus asked. Benjamin's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Marcus straighten his spine instinctively. "Sure that you were the right one. You see, I've been doing this for quite some time now. 47 years, to be exact. Finding young people like yourself, brilliant, hardworking, deserving, who've had doors closed in their faces, and helping those doors open again." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age, but the headline was still clear. "Local businessman establishes secret scholarship fund." "That article is from 1977, Benjamin said. "The reporter got most of it wrong. as reporters often do, made it sound like some grand gesture of charity. But it wasn't about charity then, and it isn't now. It's about justice, about legacy, about making sure that perfect isn't just enough. It's undeniable. Diana's hand found Marcus's shoulder, gripping it tightly. "How many?" she asked softly. 112, Benjamin replied. "That's how many students I've helped so far. Doctors now, teachers, lawyers, scientists, each one carrying forward the dream that was almost denied them." He turned to Marcus. "But you're different. You remind me of someone I knew long ago. Someone who believed that education wasn't just about learning facts and figures, but about lifting others up along the way." Marcus thought about Tommy Chen's college acceptance, about the kids he tutored at church, about Mrs. Martinez's grateful smile when he carried her groceries. "The letter," Benjamin continued, gesturing to the paper in Marcus's hands, "explains everything. The scholarship, the conditions, the choice that lies before you." "Choice?" Marcus asked. Benjamin's face softened. "Yes, because this isn't just about money for tuition. This is about becoming part of something larger, a chain of helping hands, reaching back through time and forward into the future." He moved to the window, looking out at the neighborhood below. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, I watched you help people at that store. Not because it was your job. Most of what you did wasn't in your job description at all. You helped because that's who you are." Turning back to face them, Benjamin's voice grew serious. "But I also watched something else. I watched you start to give up. Saw you yesterday, taking down those college pennants. Saw the light in your eyes dimming day by day." Marcus felt his mother's grip on his shoulder tighten. "That's why I decided it was time," Benjamin continued. "Time to step out of the shadows. Time to pass on not just a scholarship, but a responsibility." He took out his phone and made a quick call. "Yes," he said to whoever was on the other end. "I found him." After listening for a moment, he smiled. "Yes, he's perfect. Perfect." The word that had haunted Marcus for days now felt different coming from Benjamin's lips. Not a standard to meet, but a truth to embrace. "Read the letter," Benjamin said softly. "Take time to think about it. Talk it over with your mother. But know this, what was taken from you unjustly, I can restore, not as charity, but as recognition of what you've already proven yourself to be." He moved toward the door, his cane tapping a gentle rhythm. "I'll be at the store on Tuesday in my usual spot. If you accept, come tell me then. If not..." He paused. "Well, there are other deserving students, but they won't be you." At the door, Benjamin turned one last time. "Mrs. Johnson, your son reminds me so much of..." But that's a story for another time, perhaps. Read the letter. Think about the future. Not just yours, Marcus, but the futures you could help shape. After he left, the apartment seemed somehow both smaller and larger than before. Diana and Marcus stood in the kitchen, the letter between them, while the echo of Benjamin's cane faded down the hallway. "Mama," Marcus whispered. Diana nodded, and together they began to read the letter that promised not just to restore Marcus's dream, but to make it part of something far greater than either of them had imagined. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as their eyes moved across the words. Outside, the sun was setting, painting their small apartment in shades of gold and promise. From somewhere down the street, The sound of children playing floated up through the window. The next generation, perhaps, who would one day need someone to help them carry their own dreams forward. The letter trembled slightly in their hands as they read the final paragraph. Diana's breath caught in her throat. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat, because the words on that expensive paper didn't just offer him a way to attend to become part of a legacy. A chain of light reaching back through decades of darkness. A promise not just to succeed, but to help others succeed. And at the very bottom, in Benjamin Wright's elegant handwriting, was a final note that made everything else fade away. I.P.S. Ask your mother about the photograph in her dresser drawer, the one from the summer of 1963. Some dreams are born long before we know they're ours to carry. Marcus looked at his mother, questions forming on his lips, but the expression on her face stopped him. She was already moving toward her bedroom, toward the drawer that held whatever secret Benjamin Wright somehow knew she kept there. The sound of the drawer opening seemed to echo through their apartment like a starting gun at a race that had begun long before Marcus was born. Diana's hands trembled as she lifted the old shoebox from her dresser drawer. Marcus had never seen it before, though he'd lived in this apartment his entire life. The cardboard was soft with age, its corners rounded and worn, held together with yellowed tape that had long ago lost its strength. She carried it to her bed and sat down, patting the space beside her. Marcus joined her, feeling the weight of history in the air between them. "I haven't opened this box in almost 20 years," Diana said softly. "Not since your father passed." She lifted the lid carefully, as if handling something both precious and dangerous. Inside, Marcus caught glimpses of old papers, faded ribbons, and beneath them all, a manila envelope that seemed to hold whatever secret Benjamin Wright had known about. Diana reached for the envelope but stopped, her hand hovering above it. "Before I show you this," she said, "I need to tell you about a dream I had when I was your age. A dream that died so quietly, I thought no one had heard it fall." She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "I wanted to be a nurse," she said. "Not just a nurse's aide, but a registered nurse, maybe even a nurse practitioner someday. I had the grades, had the determination, had everything except the money," Marcus finished quietly. Diana nodded. "But it was more than that. There was a nursing program at State University, full scholarship. I applied, along with my best friend Sarah. Our grades were identical. Our recommendations were the same. But she got in, and I." She turned back to the box, finally reaching for the envelope. "The day I found out, my father was so angry. Not at me, never at me, but at the system. He had been fighting against these kinds of injustices his whole life. He was part of the civil rights movement, always peacefully protesting, always believing that change was possible if enough good people stood up." From the envelope, she pulled out a black and white photograph. The edges were creased, the surface marked with tiny ripples of age, but the image was clear. A group of men standing on the steps of what looked like a courthouse. They held signs calling for equal education and fair treatment. "That's your grandfather," Diana said, pointing to a tall man in the center of the group. And next to him, Marcus leaned closer. Standing shoulder to shoulder with his grandfather was a younger version of Benjamin Wright. "They were best friends," Diana continued, her voice thick with emotion. "They fought together, dreamed together, planned together. They believed that education was the key to everything. Opportunity, equality, justice." She touched the photograph gently, tracing the outline of her father's face. "The day after I Got rejected from the nursing program, Daddy and Benjamin had a meeting planned with the university board. They had evidence of discrimination, proof of unfair practices. They were going to fight for me, just like they'd fought for so many others. Marcus felt his heart squeeze. What happened? Diana's eyes filled with tears. There was a protest that morning, peaceful, like always. But someone, no one ever knew who, started a fire. The crowd panicked. In the chaos, she stopped, taking a shaky breath. My father pushed some children out of the way of a falling beam. He saved their lives, but he couldn't save his own. The photograph trembled in her hands. I never saw Benjamin Wright after the funeral. Never knew what happened to their fight, their plans, their dreams. I took the nurse's aide job, telling myself it was enough, that some dreams cost too much to keep. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, as if seeing him with new eyes. And now, here you are, facing the same wall I faced. And here he is, after all these years, offering you what my father and he fought to make possible. Marcus stared at the photograph, at these two men who had stood together for justice decades before he was born. One of them, his grandfather, whom he'd never met. The other, the quiet stranger who had watched some standard set long ago. But why didn't he tell you? Marcus asked. Why watch from a distance all this time? Diana shook her head. I don't know, but I think... She paused, considering. I think maybe he needed to be sure that you had earned this on your own, without any connection to the past. Sure that you were fighting the same fight they fought, even without knowing it. She returned to the box, pulling out more photographs, old letters, newspaper clippings, each one a piece of a story Marcus had never known, a legacy he had been carrying without realizing it. Your grandfather used to say that education wasn't just about learning, Diana said, reading from one of the letters. It was about lifting. Lifting yourself up, yes, but more importantly, lifting others with you. Marcus thought about Benjamin's words earlier, a chain of helping hands reaching back through time and forward into the future. The apartment buzzer sounded, making them both jump. Diana wiped her eyes quickly and went to answer it. Yes, Mrs. Johnson? A familiar voice crackled through the speaker. It's Mrs. Torres. I have something you need to see. Something about Benjamin Wright. Diana pressed the button to let her in. While they waited, she carefully returned the photographs to their box, except for the one of Benjamin and her father. This she handed to Marcus. Whatever Mrs. Torres has found, she said, whatever decision you make about Benjamin's offer, know that you come from a line of people who never stopped believing in the power of dreams. Not just their own dreams, but the dreams of others. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew closer. Marcus looked one last time at the photograph in his hands, at his grandfather's determined face, at Benjamin's unwavering stance beside him. Two men who had fought for a future they might never see, planting seeds of hope in soil watered with their own sacrifices. A knock at the door echoed through the apartment. Whatever Mrs. Torres had discovered about Benjamin Wright waited on the other side, another piece of a puzzle that had started assembling itself long before Marcus had opened that first rejection letter from Riverside University. Diana squeezed his hand before moving to answer the door. Ready? Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the photograph in his hands, the echo of his grandfather's dreams in his heart, and the growing certainty that some dreams were meant to cost everything, not to break us, but to show us what we were capable of carrying. Mrs. Torres burst into the apartment, her face flushed with excitement, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. She stopped short when she saw the photograph in Marcus's hands. "You already know," she said, looking between Marcus and Diana. "About Benjamin Wright." "We know some," Diana replied. "About his connection to my father. About his scholarship program." Mrs. Torres shook her head. "That's just the beginning." She spread the contents of her folder across their kitchen table. "I've spent all day researching, making calls, following leads. Benjamin Wright isn't just any benefactor. He's a legend," a deep voice finished from the doorway. They turned to find Pastor Reynolds standing there, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Marcus held. "I apologize for following you up," he said to Mrs. Torres. "But when you called about Benjamin Wright, I had to come, had to see for myself." He moved to the table, picking up one of Mrs. Torres's documents. "You see, every black educator in this city knows the name Benjamin Wright. We just didn't know he was still fighting." Marcus placed the photograph on the table. "What do you mean?" Pastor Reynolds sat down heavily. In 1963, Benjamin Wright was a young teacher. Brilliant. Could have taught at any university in the country. But he chose to stay here, teaching, at segregated schools, fighting for equal education. Mrs. Torres picked up the story, pointing to newspaper clippings. He started small, tutoring students after school, helping them apply to colleges, using his connections to open doors that had been sealed shut. "But then he met my father," Diana said softly. "Yes." Pastor Reynolds nodded. Together, they built something extraordinary. A network of educators, community leaders, professionals, all working secretly to help students who'd been denied opportunities despite their merit. Mrs. Torres spread out more papers. "I found records of over 100 students he's helped. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, teachers, each one successful, and each one carrying forward the mission." "What mission?" Marcus asked, though somehow he already knew. "To lift as you climb," Pastor Reynolds quoted. Every student Benjamin helped had to make a promise. Not just to succeed, but to help others succeed. To fight discrimination not just with protests, but with proof. Proof that excellence cannot be denied. The photograph of her father and Benjamin. "After my father died, why didn't he ever tell me? All these years." "Because of this," Mrs. Torres said, pulling out one final document. The original scholarship agreement from 1963. "Look at the witness signature." Diana leaned forward, her hand flying to her mouth. That's my mother's signature." "Yes," Mrs. Torres said gently. "Your parents were part of the original plan. They knew that change wouldn't come in their lifetime. So they planted seeds. Seeds that would grow into a forest of opportunity." Marcus thought about Benjamin sitting on his bench at the grocery store, watching. Not just watching him work, but watching him help others. Watching him live the very mission his grandfather had died believing in. A knock at the door startled them all. Benjamin Wright stood in the hallway, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "I thought I might find you all here," he said, smiling. "Mind if I join this little history lesson?" The small apartment should have felt crowded with all of them there, but somehow it didn't. It felt right, as if the room had been waiting for this moment, this gathering, this revelation. Benjamin made his way to the table, touching the old photograph gently. "James," he said, naming Marcus's grandfather. "He would be so proud, not just of you, Marcus, but of all the lives you've already touched, the students you've tutored, the people you've helped, the dreams you've kept alive." he turned to Diana. "I'm sorry I stayed away. After James died, I thought it best to let you find your own path. But I never stopped watching, never stopped hoping. And when I saw Marcus," his voice caught, "when I saw him showing the same spirit, the same dedication to lifting others, I knew it was time." Mrs. Torres spoke up. "The Scholarship Committee at Riverside, their practices are being investigated. Thanks to the evidence I gathered. Evidence that might have remained hidden if not for Marcus's rejection leading us to look deeper. Sometimes," Benjamin said, "a closed door becomes a spotlight, illuminating injustices that have hidden too long in shadow." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, different from the first one, but just as official looking. "The board of my foundation met this morning. Unanimously voted to not only fund Marcus's education, but to establish a new scholarship in James Johnson's name. A scholarship for students who demonstrate not just academic excellence, but a commitment to lifting others as they climb." Diana began to cry, quiet tears of joy and memory and vindication. Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "So, young man," Benjamin said, fixing Marcus with those clear, knowing eyes, "are you ready to carry this legacy forward? To become not just a student, but a link in a chain of change that stretches back through generations and forward into a future we can only imagine?" Marcus looked around the room, at his mother's tears, at Mrs. Torres's triumphant smile, at Pastor Reynolds's proud nod, at the photograph of two young men who had dared to dream of this moment decades ago. He thought about Tommy Chen, now heading to college himself, about the kids he tutored at church, about Mrs. Martinez and her grocery bags, about all the dreams waiting to be born, waiting to be carried, waiting to be passed on. "Yes," he said, his voice strong and sure. "I'm ready." Benjamin smiled, a smile that held 60 years of hopes and struggles and victories. "Then let's begin. After all," he said, picking up the photograph of himself and James Johnson, "some dreams are too important to let go. Some dreams are meant to cost everything we have, so they can give everything we hope for." Outside, the city hummed with life. With dreams being born, dreams being fought for, dreams being passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. And in that small apartment, surrounded by the past and the future, Marcus Johnson became part of something larger than himself. A legacy of light, a chain of hope, a promise kept through time. The photograph of two young men fighting for justice lay on the table between them all. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not just a memory, but a map to a future where dreams wouldn't have to cost too much to keep, because they would be carried by many hands, lifted by many hearts, passed on through many lives. Some dreams, Marcus now understood, weren't meant to be kept at all. They were meant to be shared. Thank you for joining us for Dreams Deferred, Hope Restored. Stories like Marcus's remind us that kindness and determination can ripple through generations, changing lives in ways we may never fully see. We'd love to know, where are you listening from? Your story matters to our growing community of listeners who believe in the power of lifting others as we climb. If Marcus's journey touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Share more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the power of unexpected kindness. Remember, as Benjamin Wright showed us, sometimes being a light for others means sitting quietly on a bench, watching, waiting, and believing in someone's potential until they're ready to believe in it themselves. Until our next story, keep spreading kindness. You never know whose life you might change.